A $3 million turbine sits dead on the test stand with 22 hours until the roadshow demonstration, and the woman about to lose everything over it is about to order the one man who can fix it to go read a manual he wrote and was never credited for. It has failed 3 times in 6 days, and each failure has looked slightly different on the diagnostics, which is the kind of pattern that makes engineers nervous in a way outright breakage never does. 12 underwriters stand in a loose crescent around the test stand at the Larkin Field Depot, coffee cooling in their hands, watching a $300 million valuation cool along with it. Meredith Ashby stands closest to the machine, arms crossed, 2 fingers tapping the clipboard against her forearm in a rhythm that has nothing to do with music and everything to do with a woman counting hours she does not have. She turns, scanning the floor for someone to blame, and her eyes land on a man in a gray canvas jacket standing near the intake housing, hands loose at his sides, watching the turbine the way other men watch a fire they already know how to put out. She does not know his name. She does not ask it. "Read the manual," she says, sharp enough to cut through the murmur of the underwriters, and turns on her heel before anyone can answer her, heels clicking away across polished concrete toward a conference room where a $340 million future is waiting to be decided by people who have never once touched the thing they are about to sell. Nolan Brennan does not follow her with his eyes. He does not straighten or bristle or do any of the small performative things men do when they've been dismissed in public. He looks back at the turbine, and for 1 second, before Harold Kessler, standing by the toolboxes, lets out a breath he'd been holding since the moment she walked in. Nobody in that building understands what has just happened, or who has just been told, by the very company that erased his name from its own manual 7 years ago, to go read a book that would still say, if anyone printed it honestly, that he wrote every page of it. Stay with this one to the end. The manual isn't the only thing in this story that was rewritten. That morning had started the way all his mornings started, which was to say quietly, and in the particular order that 8 years of fatherhood had worn into him like a groove in soft wood. Oatmeal on a low flame, stirred twice, never left. Nell's backpack by the door, packed the night before because a rushed morning was a wasted one. Her socks never matched, and she never wanted them to. It was a fact he had stopped questioning around the time she turned 6, the same year she started noticing things the way he did, quietly, sideways, without asking to be told twice. Before he woke her, he stood in her doorway a moment, the way he did every morning, and set 2 fingers against the barrel of a fountain pen resting on her dresser. Rosalind's pen, capped and dry for 4 years now, kept upright in a chipped ceramic mug that had once held coloring pencils, and straightened it a ½ inch so it sat parallel to the edge of the wood. He never explained why. She never asked. It was not a ritual either of them had ever discussed aloud. It existed the way certain habits exist between people who love someone the same way at the same time, wordlessly, because naming it might have made it smaller. 9 years ago, he had walked out of Ashby Calloway's downtown engineering tower with a cardboard box and a severance letter that used the word restructuring 4 times and his name 0. And he had not walked back through those doors since, not because he couldn't have found other work in the industry, but because by the time the merger swallowed his division whole, Rosalind was already sick, and a man with a newly diagnosed wife and a 2-year-old daughter does not have the luxury of chasing down who took his name off a copyright page. He took the depot job instead, modest pay, honest hours, work that let him be home for dinner, and he never once, in 9 years, told anyone at Larkin Field that he had designed the very turbine control module they served now as a second-shift maintenance line. Rosalind had died 4 years ago this spring. Ovarian cancer, quiet and fast at the end, the way the worst ones sometimes are. And what she'd left him with, besides Nell, was a habit of finishing what he started and saying less than he knew. She used to edit his design documents at the kitchen table, red pen in hand, telling him a schematic without a clear story was just decoration. He'd loved her for sentences like that. He still did. At the depot that Tuesday, nobody knew any of it, and nobody had reason to ask. Harold Kessler, who ran the floor and had run it for 18 years, did know, had known since the day Nolan walked in looking for quiet work, and Harold recognized the name on his intake form from a manual he'd used for a decade. Harold had said nothing to anyone. He'd simply given Nolan the hardest turbines on the schedule and watched him fix things nobody else on the floor could explain, and let the man have whatever piece he'd come looking for. The roadshow team arrived at Larkin Field a little after 9 that morning, 12 underwriters and their aides trailing Meredith Ashby like a comet's tail, all of them there to watch the T9 demonstration that was supposed to anchor Ashby Calloway's public offering in 5 days' time. Camille Underwood, the depot's lead reliability engineer, met them at the door with a folder of diagnostic printouts and the particular brightness of someone who has rehearsed her opening line in the mirror. She did not know Nolan's history either. She knew him as the man who came in at 6 and left at 3, who fixed things quietly and never volunteered an opinion in a meeting. And when Meredith asked, gesturing loosely toward the test stand, who that was standing near the intake housing, Camille answered without pausing to think about it. Maintenance guy. He's fine. He doesn't really do the technical conversations. She said it kindly enough, the way you'd describe furniture, and Meredith nodded once and moved past him toward the readouts without a second glance, because a woman 5 days from an IPO signing does not spend her attention on men in frayed collars. The turbine had failed for the 3rd time at 4 that morning. A shutdown Camille's own diagnostic software had flagged as a rotor imbalance, though the software had flagged something different each of the previous 2 times, which was itself the thing nobody in the room wanted to say aloud. Meredith stood in front of the dead machine with her underwriters at her back and asked, not for the first time that morning, whether anyone could explain why a turbine control system with a flawless service record for 8 years had suddenly become unreliable in the 6 days before the most important demonstration of her career. Nobody answered her. Nolan, 3 feet away, had already moved to the housing and set his palm flat against the casing, listening to a machine that had gone silent, the way a man checks a sleeping child's breathing rather than a monitor's readout. Meredith caught the gesture out of the corner of her eye and mistook stillness for idleness. "This isn't a museum," she said, loud enough that a few of the underwriters looked up. "If you don't have a diagnostic to run, get out of the way." Nolan straightened, unhurried, and said only, "It's not the rotor." 4 words, delivered flatly, no defense in them, which Meredith heard as insolence rather than information, because she had already decided, 3 feet away from the truth, exactly who this man was and was not. "Read the manual," she said again, sharper this time, and Camille, embarrassed on her behalf, added under her breath that maybe he should let the engineers handle the diagnosis, and Harold Kessler, watching from beside the toolboxes, said nothing at all, jaw tight, because the last time he'd tried to correct a room full of important people about Nolan Brennan, nobody had believed him then either. Nolan didn't argue. He didn't explain that he'd already run the numbers Camille's software was built from, or that the manual in question had once carried his name on its first page before someone decided that page was inconvenient. He simply turned back to the turbine, set his palm against the casing again, and closed his eyes halfway, the posture of a man listening for something the room had stopped believing existed. The truth underneath the readout. He stayed like that for over an hour. The underwriters drifted toward the coffee station and back, checking phones, murmuring about schedule slippage, and twice Meredith crossed the floor to ask with visible restraint whether he had anything yet. And twice he answered only that he was still listening, which she took as evasion, and which was, in fact, exactly true. Camille's software had already run 4 full diagnostic cycles and returned 4 different fault codes: rotor imbalance, then a false bearing temperature spike, then a sensor fault that cleared itself, then nothing detectable at all, and it was the nothing that unsettled her most, because a machine that fails without cause is a machine no report can explain to an underwriter. Nolan ignored the terminal entirely. He worked instead with his hand in his ear, tracing the turbine's housing in slow passes, pausing at the same point along the casing each time, a spot no scanner had flagged because no scanner had been told to look there. He was listening for a specific irregular harmonic, a faint stutter in the vibration pattern just above the bearing seat, the kind of signature that lived in tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Tolerances he had written into the original specification 8 years earlier, back when the T9's control module existed only as a stack of his own hand-drawn schematics and Rosalind's red ink notes in the margins, telling him a number without a reason, was just a guess, dressed up as an answer. "We don't have time for a story," Meredith said, the fourth time she checked on him, arms crossed, two fingers drumming against her elbow. "I need a fix, not a meditation." Nolan didn't look up. "You'll have one," he said. "It isn't in the software." She studied him a moment, the frayed collar, the ink stain worn pale into the cuff, and made the same mistake again, filing as calm as stubbornness rather than certainty. She told Camille to start calling outside contractors, someone from the turbine manufacturer's regional service center, anyone who could be on site before the roadshow demonstration tomorrow at 11. And Camille, already dialing, shot Nolan an apologetic look that wasn't quite an apology, more the look of someone protecting her own position by seeming decisive in front of the people who could end her career with a phone call. Harold Kessler watched the exchange from the toolboxes, arms folded, saying nothing, because he had learned 9 years ago exactly how much good it did to speak up for a man everyone in the room had already decided not to see. The turbine sat dead between them, an hour and 11 minutes into Nolan's silence, 20 hours now until the demonstration. And nobody but Harold understood that the man with his palm against the housing had built the machine's nervous system before any of them had ever set foot in this building. At the hour and 12-minute mark, Nolan opened his eyes. He didn't announce anything. He walked to the toolbox, selected a bearing fit gauge that Camille didn't recognize because it hadn't been standard depot equipment in years, and made an adjustment to the coupling at the exact point along the housing where he'd stopped his hand each pass, a half-turn correction so small that Camille, watching over his shoulder now with her phone still in hand, couldn't see what it had changed. "Run it," he said. Meredith, arms still crossed, gave a short nod more out of exhaustion than belief, and Camille keyed the startup sequence. The turbine spun up clean, no stutter, no fault code, no false spike, and held there, humming at a pitch so even that even the underwriters, half listening from the coffee station, turned to look. It ran for 3 full minutes without a single flagged irregularity, longer than it had managed in 6 days, and the room did the thing rooms do when they don't yet know what they're feeling. It went quiet. Meredith crossed to him first. "How did you know the tolerance?" she said. Not quite a question, more a demand dressed as one. "That's not in any diagnostic. That's not even in the current spec sheet." Nolan looked at her, unhurried, the way he'd looked at the turbine an hour earlier. "It's in the manual," he said. "Page 1. She frowned, the two-fingered tap on her clipboard finally stilling. "Then get me the manual." He already had it. Harold had set it on the workbench without being asked, the cloth-bound original, spine-cracked white, and Nolan opened it not to the schematics but to the front matter, the copyright page, and turned it so it faced her. A blank strip of white space sat where a line of text should have been, just above the printing date, the kind of gap a careless eye would read as margin and a careful one would read as a deletion. "There used to be a name here," Nolan said, and it was Harold who spoke next, stepping forward from the toolboxes for the first time all morning, his voice even but carrying. "There was," Harold said. "It read, authored by N. Brennan. I used this manual for 10 years before someone reprinted it without that line." He looked at Meredith, then at Nolan, then back at the page. "Same man standing in front of you now." Nobody in that room said anything for what felt like a very long time. Somewhere behind Meredith, one of the underwriters lowered his coffee cup without drinking from it. Camille's phone, still open to the contractor's number, went dark in her hand. The underwriters did not leave the depot in triumph. They left it with a new problem, which was, in its own way, the more dangerous outcome. By that evening, the lead underwriter had sent a formal notice requiring a written incident report. 5 business days, no extensions, an explanation for the failure pattern and the credit discrepancy both, before the prospectus could go to print. Meredith read the email twice, standing in the depot's back office, the turbine humming faithfully on the floor behind her, and understood for the first time that a fixed machine and a settled question were not the same thing. She had a working turbine and an unanswered manual. That was worse than a dead turbine and no questions at all. Camille Underwood, given the report to draft, did the only thing she knew how to do under pressure, which was go back to the paperwork. She pulled the parts ledger for the T9 line that night, meaning to build a clean timeline of maintenance and replacement to satisfy the underwriter's request, and it was there, cross-referencing invoice numbers against the original 2016 design file Harold had produced from a locked drawer, that she found something her diagnostic software had never been built to notice, because software only flags what someone tells it to check. The bearing supplier, listed on every purchase order for the past 7 years, did not match the supplier certified in Nolan's original design specification. Not a clerical variance, not a rounding difference in part number, a different manufacturer entirely, one she didn't recognize, buried under a generic parts code that made it look, at a glance, like the certified original. She sat with the 2 documents open side by side for a long time, the office empty around her, and felt something colder than professional embarrassment settle into her chest. Not one turbine, but every T9 module serviced at Larkin Field in 7 years had been running on a bearing nobody with authority had ever actually approved. She brought it to Nolan first, not Meredith, some instinct telling her the man who'd been dismissed that morning was the only one in the building who would know what she was looking at without needing it explained twice. He studied the ledger for a long moment, quiet in a way that made the silence itself feel like an answer. "That's not a maintenance problem," he said finally. "That's a paperwork problem wearing a maintenance problem's clothes." Camille asked what he meant. He didn't elaborate, not yet, but Harold, standing at her shoulder, went very still, the particular stillness of a man who has just recognized a name he hasn't let himself think about in years. The purchase orders led back through 3 shell layers before the trail widened into something a determined engineer with a weekend and a company email archive could actually follow. Camille found the supplier's registration first, a firm called Corvain Fabrication, incorporated 8 years ago, its listed ownership address matching, after one more search, the same address as a residential property registered to a man named Wallace Pruitt, who turned out, after a call to the county clerk's office, to be the brother-in-law of Cornelius Pennington, Ashby Calloway's vice president of procurement for the past 11 years. The invoices themselves were unremarkable on their face, competitive pricing, standard terms, until Camille cross-checked delivery dates against the reprint date of the maintenance manual and found they lined up within 4 months of each other, 7 years ago, the same season the copyright page had gone from naming its author to naming no one. She brought the full chain to Nolan and Harold together, laid out on the same workbench where the turbine had spun clean 2 days before, and it was Harold who finally said the thing he'd carried quietly for 9 years. "Pennington signed off on your reassignment," he told Nolan. "Back when the merger happened, I always thought it was just cost-cutting. I never thought—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. A substituted bearing, cheaper and uncertified, would fail exactly the way the T9 had been failing, unpredictably, at tolerances too fine for standard diagnostics to catch, and the only design file that specified the correct part clearly enough to expose the substitution had belonged to an engineer. Pennington had made sure was no longer in the building to ask questions. Meredith received the full report from Camille on the morning of day 4, 1 day before the underwriter's deadline, and read it standing at her father's old desk, which she had never had reupholstered or replaced in 6 years of running the company he'd built. She called for the original 2016 design authorization herself, the physical file, not the digital scan, and found it in a records box that hadn't been opened since the merger. 2 signatures sat on the approval line, Cornelius Pennington's, dated and neat, and beneath it, in the looser hand she recognized from birthday cards and the backs of old photographs, her father's. Cornelius Ashby had personally approved Nolan Brennan's original design and the certified bearing specification that went with it, 7 years before his own procurement chief quietly substituted a cheaper part and erased the name of the man who would have caught it. Meredith sat with that for a long time in the empty office, the turbine's hum still faintly audible through the depot wall, and understood that the cover-up she was holding in her hands didn't just implicate an employee. It ran directly through the legacy she had inherited, sat in, and never once questioned. The board convened on the morning of day 5, 3 hours before the underwriter's deadline, in the same conference room Meredith had walked into after telling Nolan to read a manual he'd written. Cornelius Pennington's resignation letter had already been typed and signed before the meeting started, Camille's evidence chain had left him no room to argue, and he hadn't tried, offering only a clipped acknowledgement that the supplier arrangement had reduced procurement costs for 7 years, a sentence Meredith let hang in the air without dignifying it with a response. His departure was handled the way the company handled everything that quarter, quietly, on paper, with lawyers present and no scene made of it. Nobody in that room enjoyed watching a man lose his position. They simply let the documents speak, and the documents had already said everything that needed saying. What Meredith did next, she did in front of the full board, with Nolan and Harold and Camille seated at the far end of the table where guests usually sat. She didn't read from notes. 6 years ago I inherited a company my father built, she said, and in 6 years I never once asked who actually designed the machine it was named for. I asked what it was worth. I asked when it would ship. I never asked who built it or why his name wasn't on it anymore. And I'm the only person in this room who had the authority to ask that question at any point in the last 6 years and didn't. She turned to Nolan directly. I'm offering you your title back, Chief Systems Engineer, and a settlement for 9 years and for what happened on that floor Tuesday. Whatever figure your attorney thinks is fair, I'll sign it without negotiating. Nolan was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that made the board members shift slightly in their chairs, unused to silence being used as an answer. I don't want the title, he said finally. I've got work I like, and a daughter who needs me home by 4. I don't want a settlement either, not because I don't think I'm owed one, because the money would close this out, and closing it out isn't what I want. He looked at the manual on the table between them, its spine still cracked white. Reprint it, with my name on the page where it belongs, and put whatever you were going to pay me into an independent audit fund instead. Outside inspectors, no ties to procurement, checking every part against every original spec, every year for as long as this company exists. Meredith looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face, the practiced composure of 6 years running a public-facing company, gave way to something plainer. That's it? That's all you want? That's what matters, he said. Rosalind used to say a manual only matters if the truth in it outlives the man who wrote it. He didn't say her name aloud in that room. He didn't need to. The board voted to approve both requests before the underwriter's deadline passed, unanimous, and no one in that room mistook the quiet on Nolan's face for anything other than what it was. 3 months later, the reprinted T9 manuals arrived at Larkin Field in a shipment of 400, cloth-bound, the copyright page reading, plainly, authored by N. Brennan, Systems Engineering, with a second line beneath it crediting the independent audit program that now bore no one's name at all, only its purpose. Camille Underwood led the depot's new part certification process, cross-checking every supplier against the original design files twice a quarter, a task she'd once have called excessive and now called necessary. And Harold Kessler stood beside her at every review, not because he needed to anymore, but because 18 years of watching had made him someone worth listening to, and Camille had finally started listening. Nolan still came in at 6 and left at 3. He hadn't taken the title. He hadn't needed to. The roadshow prospectus that eventually printed carried a footnote about the T9's design history that made more than one underwriter ask quietly why a company would let a man like that stay in a depot jacket, a question Meredith answered only by saying that some people build empires and some people build turbines, and it wasn't her place to decide which mattered more to a man who'd already made his own choice. That evening, at home, Nell set her mother's fountain pen back into its chipped ceramic mug on her dresser, beside a small paperback copy of the T9 manual her father had brought home for her without much explanation, the kind of gift an 8-year-old shouldn't have found interesting and somehow did. She'd asked him only one question about the whole thing, days earlier, not 5, just the one that mattered. Did they forget your name, or did somebody take it? He'd told her the truth. She hadn't asked anything else. Now she lined the pen up parallel to the manual's spine, the way she'd watched him line up things his whole life without either of them ever calling it a habit worth naming, and climbed into bed. Nolan stood in the doorway a moment, the way he did every night, and knocked twice against the frame before easing the door shut. Never 3, an old rule with no origin either of them could name anymore. Just a shape that had outlasted the reasons for it, the way the truest things do. If you believe the people who build things deserve to have their names on them, you already know why this one mattered.